Well, good morning. It's good to be here with you guys. As Jim said, my name is Brandon. I'm one of our youth pastors here. I'm really excited to be here. If I look a little tired, I apologize. It's because I'm coming off of an all-nighter with our youth group this weekend. We had our back-to-school rally, so going on about 7 hours of sleep for the entire weekend. We had a ton of fun, though, and, luckily my dad's taught me a lot about hard work growing up, so that, in combination with an endless supply of Red Bull, brings me here this morning. So, my dad always had interesting methods of teaching me the meaning of hard work growing up. And that would start with small things, with like little chores. And I always remember I'd get home from school. Dishes was one of my jobs. And so I'd get in. And before my backpack could even hit the floor, my dad was there to remind me that there were dishes in the sink from breakfast that needed to be cleaned up. And things like that would get a little frustrating as I went along. But there was one chore that was worse than all the others. And that was mowing the lawn. And I want to add that mowing the lawn used to be an enjoyable thing for me. When I grew up in Missouri, it was a small lawn. We had a push mower. It took about 20 minutes to get the entire thing done. I liked how it looked when it was done. The weather had it to where it was a nice green yard. And it was pretty enjoyable. And then all of that changed for me when we moved to Tennessee. Tennessee, the summers are a little more extreme, and our yard was about 4 times the size of the one in Missouri, so it took about an hour and 20 minutes to mow. And it was a lot bigger, so, it was a yard that would warrant the use of a riding mower. And so I'd always tell my dad, I'm like, Dad, we got the new house, we should probably get a riding mower. And we never did, but I want to add, after I graduated high school, that was when he added that to our tools list. So he had a riding mower, because apparently he had different opinions on how the yard should be mowed after I left. Luckily for my little brother. So, the summers would get extremely hot in Tennessee. It was extremely hot and extremely humid. And so by the beginning of June to mid-June, pretty much anything that was in the sun was dead. It was totally scorched. And then anything that was in the shade was growing like crazy. And so in our particular case, the backyard, which was the biggest yard between the two, had no shade at all. So by the beginning of June, it was all dead. And logically, as you look at mowing the lawn and the responsibilities that come with that, you think, oh, this is great. The biggest part of the yard is all dead. Like, you don't even have to mow it. So I'm only going to have to mow the front yard, which is under the shade of trees. It's going to take 20 minutes. I'll be done, and I'll be back to playing video games in no time. My dad had a differing opinion on that, because when he said to do a job, he meant the entire thing. And so despite the state of the backyard, if we mowed the lawn, it was to be the entire thing every single time. And this is pretty miserable for me. In high school, we were moving to the new area, so I was new to Tennessee, so my allergies were kicking up. I already had a bunch of issues with that. And when I say that the lawn was dry, I'm not talking about just dead grass. Like, I imagine like a post-apocalyptic yard. The whole thing was totally scorched. It was dusty. It was terrible. And so, when you mow, there's always a lot of dust around the mower to start with. It's just kind of little, and, it blows up a little bit. That was not how this was either. As I would mow my way across the lawn, I would turn around and be met with an entire cloud of dust that covered the entire yard. So every strip, I was turning and walking straight back through that, back and forth. And then, when you mow, you follow the lines that you've mowed in the grass. But when there's no grass, there's no lines to follow. So my dad would have us bag the yard. So, I'm mowing 3 or 4 strips and then bringing a bag of dirt down to the edge of the lawn and dumping it and shaking it all over the place, which is frustrating already. But I was hoping, I'm like, maybe I guess when the bag fills up enough, the mower will weigh enough to where I can see where I've mown in my dirt tracks here. So I'd go and I'd mow the entire yard. And, I'd complain to my mom. She'd try to get our back sometimes. She's like, Steve, it's like 108 degrees. The humidity's at 85%. There is nothing alive in the backyard except for our son when you send him out there. Like, can we cut him a break? Just let him mow the front yard. It'll look good. And all those arguments were to no avail. So week in and week out, my job was to mow the entire lawn. The other aspect that my dad would add to this weekly responsibility was a walkthrough to inspect all of our work every time we had done it. And so every time I finished, this mower that we had, it was a push mower. It was old from Missouri. The blades weren't very sharp on it. My dad was not, the best at maintenance. Like, he can change the windshield wipers on his car, but that was about all he knows about maintenance for motors and things like that. So I did the best that I could to take care of it. It burnt oil, so we'd have to put oil in it every time we used it. And we started up in a big cloud of smokes, puffing up everywhere. And so every time I finished mowing the lawn, I would get the hose out, I'd bring it down to the driveway and clean it off and try to make sure that it didn't rust and get the dirt caked off of it. And then I would put it in the garage. Our garage was really packed, and so it had a tight spot that it fit into with that and the weed eater. So I would come in, I'd bring my dust-covered self, all sweaty and hot, in, I'd pack the lawnmower up, I'd go up the stairs, get a drink of water, and be like, okay, Dad, the yard's mowed, so I'm going to get cleaned up, and then go hang out with friends or play video games. And he's like, hold on, you know how this goes. And so there's a verse from Proverbs. I think this is my dad's theme verse when it came to teaching me the meaning of hard work. It's Proverbs 12:24, and it says this: diligent hands will rule, but laziness ends in forced labor. And, sometimes, when you're doing a job that you feel is kind of meaningless and there isn't a whole lot of point to it, you can start to cut corners on the things that don't seem to take priority. So, by the wood stack, there was a couple dandelions that would grow up. And I'm like, I'm not walking all the way down to the edge of the yard to cut those. It's not that big a deal, or things like that. It boiled down to laziness. And let me tell you, it ended in forced labor. My dad was going to teach me the meaning of diligence if it was the last thing that he did. It was important to him. And so we'd go out, and my dad would inspect the yard. And as you know, when you're mowing with a push mower, the wheels kind of flatten out the grass, so you try to overlap a little bit, because when the grass comes back up, you want to make sure you get it. So I did that to the best of my ability, but there's always at least one or two little strips where the grass would stand up. And I'd already moved on to the backyard, so I never came back to the front to look and see if there's strips like that. And then, like I said, there'd be a couple weeds down by the wood stack and things like that. And so I would assume, my dad's inspecting this, that I'm hot, the mower's already cleaned up, that he would just come in and say, well, there was a couple spots you missed. Just make sure that you overlap a little more, or go back and hit it when you're done, or make sure you get the weeds by the wood pile. And then I would take care of it the next time, and that'd be the end of the story. That was not my dad. My dad would say, okay, you missed something. The job's not done. And so I would go back down into the garage, get the mower that was now clean, mow over any parts that I missed, and weed eat the weeds that I missed, and then I would have to clean it all up and put it back. I hated that process. That was the most miserable thing in the world. And little did I know that the little lessons that my dad was trying to teach me from things like mowing the lawn and the dishes and other similar tasks like cleaning out the garage was going to prepare me for a lot of different things in my future. I love to complain and laugh about these stories from my parents and things they made me do, as we all do, but my dad really did play a huge role in making me who I am today. So that work ethic, he started it then so that it would transition into all areas of my life. And so in high school, I played football. I think we have a picture from then. I weighed 170 pounds at my heaviest senior year. I'm pretty sure 5 pounds of that came from that ridiculous massive hair that I had. I don't know why nobody told me that didn't look good. One person's like, oh, it looks great. And so I kept it all 4 years. You can't get that back. But, being that small in a contact sport doesn't usually go in your favor when you're trying to knock down guys that are 200 pounds or more. So I had to make up for that by working hard, running fast, and a lot of ice baths and chiropractor visits and things like that. And so our coaches would push us hard because they had this mentality that if practice was amazingly difficult, that by the time we got to the game, it would be easy and we'd have energy and be able to outlast the other team. And so this coach that I had, he had severe ADD, as well as OCD. And those came into play a lot more than you would think. So every practice we would have conditioning. We would run 100-yard sprints until the coach got tired. And he had a particular way that he wanted us to run these sprints. He wanted the entire team to start behind the line, and we had to sprint through the final line because he wanted us to start and end right on everything that we did. And so we had 103 guys on our team. This is a lot of people to keep up with. But our coach's attention to detail was pretty crazy. So I remember there was multiple occasions we'd run a sprint and we'd get down. And typically you run to one side of the field and then you turn around and get on that line. Coach turns around, blows a whistle, and you come back. However, our coach blew the whistle way too early. So we were like, okay, yeah, what do you want, coach? He's like, okay, guys, come on back. We're like, all right, this is weird. And for those of you guys that have played sports, he said a saying that brings a lot of despair hearing it still. That one didn't count. And when you put in all the work for a sprint like that and you're already exhausted, that just it's like, oh man, I don't know that I can run more of these. And then he would explain the reason to us. If any member of the team had even a toe of their shoe on the line that we were supposed to start behind, he noticed it. And so rather than saying, hey, make sure your toe's behind the line, he would let us run the sprint and we'd come back and have to do it all again. And that taught us a lot of lessons there. And, that hard work paid off. And even though I was a smaller guy and I wasn't the most talented, I really couldn't catch a ball till sophomore year of high school. I was able to start in a lot of positions because the coaches appreciated that work ethic. I questioned their judgment on my 8th grade year. I played on the offensive line at 125 pounds as a guard. It didn't end well. They moved me later. But I wanted to play. And so that opened up opportunities for me. That also transitioned into my life in school. We've all been members of group projects in school or at work. And I was a guy, I wanted to get good grades, and I liked being in control of things. So we'd meet as a group, and I'd be like, all right, guys, here's how it's going to go. I'll bring everything home and do it. I'll email you the part that you need to present on. And then just make sure you have that part down. We'll all get an A. We all go home happy. And, of course, my group was happy to oblige my request for that. And that worked through the majority of school until I got to my senior year and had a U.S. history teacher who didn't like when people did that. So he would take all of the students in the class with the highest grades and pair them with the students in the lowest grades, which was frustrating to start with. But then on top of that, he would assign each student a particular part that they were supposed to do. So they had to do the research, and then we would turn that in individually, and we'd present. But the grade that we got was for the group as a whole. And this drove me nuts. I remember I'd be so mad I'd go home and talk to my parents. I'm like, Mom and Dad, how am I supposed to get a good grade when I'm paired with people who don't want to work hard? I was like, you know what? I hope that all these guys come to my funeral. I'm going to have them carry my casket so they can let me down one more time. I was a little dramatic. But, I think we can all agree that hard work is an important thing in life. And my dad really tried to teach me a lot about that. So the text from today is one that we've all heard probably many times before, but it's about a group of extremely hardworking guys. And it comes from Luke chapter 5, verses 1 to 11. And this is what it says. One day as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, this is another name for the Sea of Galilee, the people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen, who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put into deeper water and let down the nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we have worked hard all night and we haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." For he and all of his companions were astonished at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will become fishers of men." So they pulled their boats on shore, left everything, and followed him. So the first thing that I want to look at in this story is the life of fishermen. We think of a lot of people who fish today, and when you fish, you want to go with the people who know what they're doing and have the right equipment. So, if I'm gonna go fishing on the weekend, I'm not gonna ask Pastor Dave to fish because I want to catch something. I'm gonna go out and I'm gonna talk to Bill Slater, who's a guy who fishes all the time, and he has all the stuff you need to be successful. He's got a boat, and he's got the fish finders and the fancy reels and all the lures, and he's got the works. When you fish with this guy, you're gonna come home with some fish. The guys in the Bible did not have that. They had to work incredibly hard to catch anything. They're out in rowboats. They had nets, not reels, and they used a lot of elbow grease. And they worked hard day in and day out to make a living. And so, in order to be successful, they don't have fish finders. They have to row all over the lake to try to find fish. And a lot of times that meant going out in day and night and whenever they had to, working with no days off until they caught fish. And so what also made this very difficult was the nature of the Sea of Galilee, because the Sea of Galilee sits in a valley, and there's a bunch of different mountain ranges that sit around it. So what will happen is a lot of storms come through the mountain ranges, and they kind of converge over the sea, and this causes some crazy waters and lightning and all kinds of stuff. We read in the Bible later on about Jesus calming the storm. This is known for how rough the waters are. It's not an easy place to be out in a boat, and especially to fish. And so the fishermen in the day, often they would fish through the night. This was a more successful time for them to fish. So they're out there in choppy waters on rowboats with a couple of them had sails and things like that. And they're fishing by torchlight, so they don't even have modern lights like we would, which makes it dark and hard to see. And they would fish all through the night, going everywhere. And they have to throw the nets in, and they're bringing them back, and it's a lot of work. It had to have been extremely tiring. And so in the text we see that these guys have been fishing all night long. And so they finally got the boats pulled up to shore and they're beginning cleanup. And this was a little more extensive than washing the dirt off of a lawnmower. You see, the nets were vital to their success in fishing because that was how they caught everything. And so they had to make sure that the nets lasted as long as they could. So every time they would come in, they didn't just crumple the net up and throw it in the boat and then come back the next day and fish. They would lay it out, and they had to pick out all the things in the net that got caught through the process of fishing, with fish bones and sticks and rocks and all kinds of things that could weaken the net. So they would do that, and then they had to lay it out in a particular way. That way it could dry and be good to use for the next day. This was a long process. And so even though they finished all this cleanup, they're finally at the shore, they're about to go home. Jesus asked them to use their boat, and they do that. And he presents them with this opportunity for success. When I think of fishing, I think of going with my dad, my brother, and sister, and we'd be fishing a pond, and it was the wrong time of day. We just weren't catching anything. But my brother and sister and I were not willing to leave until we had walked all the way around the entire pond to just guarantee that there wasn't a spot that we were just missing that the fish were in. And this is kind of the mentality that the fishermen in the day had. And so despite all the work that they'd put in all night with no sleep and then cleaning up, they took the opportunity because there was a chance of success. And in this particular instance, it paid off for them. And so a key thing in this story that I don't think we see all the time is all the work that these guys did as fishermen through their lives was preparing them for the journey they were about to embark on with Christ. They were hard workers. And hard work isn't just a virtue. Hard work is something that can be a form of worship if we set our hearts in that direction. Colossians 3:23 says this: "Whatever you do, work at it with all of your heart, as if working for the Lord and not for human masters." When we read this is an inspiring verse. It makes you want to do things as if you're doing it for Christ, and it's great in theory, but then when it comes to applying it in life, it gets a lot more difficult. When your dad's yelling at you to do the dishes when it's the first thing when you step through the door, or when your boss gets a new task and naturally because you're under him, he passes it down to you and now you're working the weekend. It's really hard to go into that and think, I'm going to have a mentality of worship in doing this work that I don't want to do. However, when we go in with that mentality, we have the ability to glorify God through our work ethic, and that makes us stand out in the world. Everybody appreciates somebody who's reliable, the guy who gives 110%, that you can always count on, who comes in with a good attitude. And in today's world, we work a ton, especially in American culture. We work more than probably any of us should. And so I was curious to see how much time we spend at work in the course of our lives. And so I looked up some statistics for this, and this is what I found. 49% of our lives is spent working or going to school, which is in preparation for life and for work. That is almost half of all the time that we have alive. 33% of our time is spent sleeping. And if you do the math, that leaves 18% for everything else that we're going to do. Eating meals, having hobbies, vacation, family time. All that stuff has to fit into the 18%. When I was reading about that, I was like, man, that is crazy. Because work we have to do, that's 49% that we don't get a choice, and sleep we have to do, but that's 18% that we control what we're going to do of. That's the only time that we get to really choose what we're going to do with. So hard work, it's important, and it impacts the effectiveness of how we spend our time, but more important than that is what we're dedicating our time to. See, before we find Christ in our lives, our focus can very easily be on the American dream and this huge success story. It's all about what college we get into. You want to get into the big name colleges, and then you want to land a job at a great company and work your way up the ladder. And before you know it, we're putting in 60 to 100-hour work weeks, trying to work our way up so that we can have a bigger house and we can support our family, and then we want a nice car and we want the dog and everything. We're always trying to work to afford more luxury in life. And it's kind of a never-ending process. It's always trying to work up. And what I want us to think about today is, what kind of work are we investing all that time in? Being successful in the world is not a bad thing. Having a great job, taking care of our families, building a future, that is great. We want to be successful in the things that we do. And those things are important for our society to function the way that it does. But as we look back at this story, we see that the fishermen have an encounter with Christ. And they heard him teach, and then he went fishing with him. But somewhere in this encounter, Christ changed something inside of them. They've spent their entire lives learning about fishing and building this business up from the ground to the point where this was their identity. The first thing we read in this story is they're identified as fishermen. They don't go by their names until later on. And we can do that a lot today, A lot of us even get into the process of wanting to be known by that, by our title, or by where we went to school, or what company we work for. How many times when you're having a conversation with somebody, one of the first questions you ask is, well, what do you do for a living, or where do you work? And those things can start to become our identity, and we find that they begin to take the main priority in our lives. And so, after the disciples had this encounter with Jesus, serious changes begin to happen. We look at them, they didn't lose their drive and the work ethic that they had, but rather they focused it on the goals of the kingdom instead of worldly success. This encounter made these guys give up everything to follow Christ. There wasn't an area that wasn't impacted by this. And as I look, looking at this in modern times and what it takes to be an entrepreneur, 3 to 5 years before you're even making a profit. And how much work it takes to build a business up from the ground and finally get it thriving. And that's essentially what these guys did. And now they have a thriving fishing business. And they have this encounter with Christ and they're willing to just drop it all. They drop their business. They leave their families, everything they know, to go on this journey with Christ. In that encounter, there wasn't a single area of their lives that wasn't impacted. It wasn't segregated. And don't hear me wrong, I'm not saying that as we leave this morning, it's like, okay, well, I guess we should all quit our jobs and jump into full-time ministry or mission somewhere. That's not what I'm saying, because we need the jobs that we have for our society to function. However, what we really need to do is take a look at what takes the priority of our efforts in our life. It blows my mind that the disciples were able to give up everything to embark with Christ. But when they committed to that, it changed everything. It impacted every single area of their lives. And had they not had the experience they did as fishermen and the drive and the work ethic that came from that, I don't think they would have been able to take on the challenges of living this call that they did with Christ. Because they go from having a business and homes and family to sleeping on the streets and even their persistence. We see their persistence in fishing, but later on after Christ died and they're called to share this news with everyone, they go into cities and they share the word and they're beaten and flogged and sent out of the city. And the first thing we see most of these guys do is turn right back around and go back into it. That work ethic carried on through to what Christ was wanting them to do with their lives. So what does that look like for us today? If we truly let this encounter we have when we accept Christ and his love for us go beyond affecting our Sunday morning schedules. What if that impacts every area of our lives? What if the relationship we have with God and his will for our life begins to trump everything else? Another thing that I don't want us to get wrong, it's really easy as we look at work and shifting that into a Christian perspective that it becomes about all the things we do. And eventually it can be easy to get into this mentality that we have to earn our relationship with Christ and we have to earn our salvation. And that's definitely not what I'm saying here either. We don't do our actions for a relationship with God. Our actions should be inspired from our relationship with God. It can be very easy to get caught up in life doing so many things for God that we realize we're not even spending any time with him. Our action should be in response to God's love for us. So how does this all become practical? Yes, we should start by working as if we're doing everything for God and bringing that mentality into play. But we also need to make some hard calls with how we spend even the 18% of our lives that we have full control over what we do with. And we have to ask ourselves, are we allowing things to take priority over what God wants for our lives? That can go from little things to big things. Sunday mornings, making sure we get home to watch the Eagles lose. Sorry, I'm a Pittsburgh fan, but those things can take priority. Or Or bigger things like when there's family crisis and everything else seems to go away because that's what's important in the time. You know, we've had a lot of loss this summer in our church. And that's impacted a ton of us. And I think that's impacted our perspective on things. And for me specifically, one of the perspectives that I've seen is how short and fragile life really is. All those percentages are based on a average lifespan that's expected for the American, but we're not even guaranteed that. And so, you know, I'm young. I'm 23 years old, and I am definitely still learning how to invest my time. But the conclusion that I've come to is that I want to know that I've made a difference for the kingdom with whatever time I've been given. Because in the end, the kingdom is all that matters. When everything else fades away, that's all that's left. And we find that our priorities change for the things that truly matter to us. So one of the harder questions I have for us to consider today is, does our relationship with Christ cause the priorities in our life to look different? You know, as we're talking about this and we're trying to find ways, okay, yeah, we're supposed to work hard and now we're supposed to apply that to our walk with Christ and being a Christian. Like, there's a ton of ways that we can be involved in building the kingdom here at home. You know, Nick and I have the privilege every week to work with the teens of our church, and that is incredible. And we have so many volunteers that come out every single Sunday to events and to all-nighters like we had this weekend, and they commit their time to that to invest in the lives of the teens, and we would not be able to do that without them. We have people that volunteer with the kids at the Village Norristown every week. Kids who don't have father figures, kids who don't feel loved, and we're able to go there and show them the love of Christ that they may not experience from anything else or anyone else in the world. We go on mission trips to our orphanage at Rancho Arriba and other places in the world, and we give of our time at outreach events like Lights in the Village and the Easter egg hunt, where we're trying to show people what we do and who we are and why we do the things that we do and expose them to the love of Christ. And then we support those ministries financially. But we also need to look at how we bridge the gap between the 18% of our lives that we have full control over and the 49% that we spend at work. Because God doesn't look at our lives and see this pie chart and see, okay, well, you have 18%, you can really decide what you want to do with, so I'll take that. That's not how He works. He says, I want all of it. So how do we make a God who wants all of our time a priority when the world calls for 50% of it to be work? You know, we don't just build the kingdom with what we do in our free time. That mentality should carry into the work that we do. And we have an example of this at our church. Some of you guys know Steve Rentz. I was able to talk to him this week, and he told me a pretty incredible story about an impact he's making for the kingdom at work through doors that God's been able to open up in his life. See, he's been at the same job for a while. He's put in a lot of effort, and he's worked up to where he's at, and so he has a lot of experience. And so he's telling me, he's like, you know, people come into my office all the time for questions and guidance on things, and, you know, I don't just like giving them answers. I like to talk through things so they understand the reasoning and the vision behind things. And so I try to keep my office really clean and open. So there's a lot of seating. There's not a lot of stuff out. My desk is always very organized and clean, so it's good for thought and conversation. And then he went on one of our trips to Rancho Arriba. And there he took a picture of some of the work we were doing, and he came home and he had this idea. He's like, you know what? Maybe I could put this on my desk. I think that would stand out because everything else is so clean, and so that might cause people to ask questions and stuff. And so he did that, and then he went on another trip to Rancho Arriba. And he sent me some pictures of a couple of things that he brought home with him. He had some concrete and a couple of pieces of scrap metal from one of the jobs they were working at. And so he put this pile of stuff on his desk next to the picture. And he said, you know, it was crazy because people would come in and they start to ask questions and then they notice it. And so they start to pick these things up and they're trying to figure out what they are. And he's like, they started to ask questions, and that opened up the door for him to share about what we're doing in Rancho Arriba. And through that, he was able to share about who God is to him and the impact that's had on his life and the reason that he acts the way that he does. And these conversations have led to some pretty incredible things. He said that there's now a prayer group of people that he meets with from his work before work every day. And they spend some time in prayer before work. And as you guys know, in the secular world, that's something that's not really easy to do a lot of times. So it's opened up the door for that. And he's been able to have open discussions with people in the office who aren't Christians about Christ. He's like, you know what, it's crazy. I'll be walking around work and I have these guys and I hear them talking to each other even. And it's people that never would have brought up church or God or anything like that. And now they're starting to ask questions and they're starting to have conversations even amongst themselves just because of these things that I put on my desk. And something that I want to point out about this is these encounters weren't forced or uncomfortable. You know, he's not walking up to them and cramming the Bible down their throat. It started with setting something on his desk. And nobody was forced to listen to him, but it was enough to spark some interest to where they had questions. And that opened the door for him to share the love of God to them. And he said it's gone beyond the office. You know, people notice how he acts. And he's like, you know, people used to describe me. It would be like, oh, Steve Rintz, you know, I'm like the short, stocky guy at work. I work upstairs in the office. And he said now he finds that people start to describe him by some of the experiences they have with him and the way that he acts. And what it boils down to is he's a kingdom builder, and they notice it. And I also want to say that this was a process. He didn't set that on his desk and then all these doors just flew open instantly. It was something that took time. But something incredible has come from this. His company recently asked him to present on the mission of Rancho to the people from his team that are spread out all over the world. So they're all coming in for a conference and they're going to meet. And they said their company's mission is to help people. And so due to some concrete, some metal, and a picture on Steve's desk, there is now a worldwide company that's interested in what Fairview Village Church is doing in Rancho Arriba. That is powerful stuff. And so through things like that and the way that we reflect Christ by bringing joy to our workplace and working hard and being willing to do things that others aren't, we're able to open doors and share about who God is and what he does for us and his love for us. And like I said, you know, we want every area and every aspect of our life and our time to go into building the kingdom of God, because the time we have is short. And so for some of us, as you hear this, it's difficult because maybe you guys are in a different stage where you're in a point where you're not working a 40-hour work week. You're working 80 and you're just trying to make ends meet, or you're trying to meet the request of your boss and things like that. And you're like, I would love to volunteer. I would love to give more time, but I'm just not able to. And this is where these two areas of our lives connect. God gives us work and he gives us opportunities, and that provides us with resources to live. And so maybe you aren't able to give of your time in this particular period of your life, but you're able to give and support financially to some of the areas of ministry that we're doing in Rancho and the Village Norristown and the kingdom building work that God has tasked us to. Everybody has a role to play in this. And the other thing, so as we think on this stuff, I don't want us to go home and be like, all right, so I went to church on Sunday, got guilt tripped. Now I need to volunteer in a couple more places. Like I can give a little more time here or there. I guess I'll chip in an extra $5 offering, and that should cover it. This isn't about feeling guilty or because it's the things that we're supposed to do as Christians. I don't want us to do this because we have a sense of obligation. See, this weekend is communion weekend, and so I was extremely excited when I found that out as I was trying to figure out how to come to a conclusion this morning. Because communion represents the reason for the change in our lives. The reason we look so different to the rest of the world. So in a minute, I'm going to pray. The ushers are going to come down and they're going to give the bread and the juice. But as they do, I want to leave us with a couple of thoughts. First of all, we don't do anything that we do out of obligation or to earn our spot in heaven. We do all of this stuff as a response in our hearts to the love that Christ has shown us. Matthew 26, verses 26 to 28 says this. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body." Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." See, Christ died to cover all of our sins. This was a debt that we could not pay if we lived for eternity and worked and did all the good things we could think of. And God knew that, so he gave his son to die for us to cover that. And some of us here today have accepted that. We've learned of this narrative of the things that Christ has done in our lives, and so we've come and we've accepted him into our lives, and now we're in a relationship with him, and we're starting to challenge ourselves on the things we need to change. Maybe some of us here are new. Maybe some of you guys are the ones that were impacted by a picture on a desk that caused you to question, like, what is this about? What would make somebody live so differently? And if that's you, I want you to know that you can have that same experience that these disciples had thousands of years ago that caused them to drop everything to follow a mission that was bigger than themselves. And the same experience that a lot of us have today when we accept Christ. I want you to know that Christ died for you because he wants to be in a relationship with you. And so as we go out this week, I want you guys to know that we all have a role in building the kingdom. And it's not just Fairview Village Church. It's the body of believers as a whole. And we're called to go and reach our community. And our community is to be kingdom building. And our community is supposed to reach our world because God wants everyone in on this. So let's go out and let's be a part of it. Let's build the kingdom here. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this morning. And we thank you for your word. That a story of an encounter that people had thousands of years ago can hit us right where we are at home in 2016. And God, as we're faced with the challenge of looking at the way we spend our time and our money and the things we prioritize, I pray that you would help guide us into knowing what your will is for that. Help us to see opportunities. And God, help us to build your kingdom. Open the doors and use us. In your name we pray. Amen.